At the very top of DAF Chaf Beis Amud Aleph, we're going to start the Mishnah. SUKKAH hamiduvleles, and we don't know what that word means, what the word miduvleles means, but it's a description of a certain kind of sukkah. V'shetzilasa meruba mechamasa, and, or, we're not sure what that letter vav means. If its shade is greater than its sunlight, kishera, then it's going to be kosher. The Gemara will explain all of this. Next case, hamauva kimin bayis, if the schach of the sukkah is so thick that it looks like you're mamish, you feel like you're in a house, afal pi she'ena kochavim nirim mitocha kishera, even though you can't see the stars because the sukkah is so thick, the schach is so thick, it's still kosher. As long as the schach is kosher, it's just thick, it's still kosher. Let's take a look at the Gemara. My miduvleles, what does that word mean? Amar Rav, sukkah aniya. So Rav says it means that it's an impoverished sukkah, meaning that there's very sparse schach. Ushmuel Amar kana olev kana yored. And Shmuel says that there's a more specific description of what this means. It means that it's disjointed schach. And when I say disjointed, I mean that some of it is above and some of it is below. It's not all on the same horizontal plane. It's disjointed. Some of it is up and some of it is down. But when you combine all of the schach together, looking at it from the bottom up, it all looks like if you have no depth perception, it all looks like it's covering the sukkah equally, so therefore it's kosher. Now the Gemara says, let's be clear on the language of the Mishnah. Rav tani chada u'shmuel tani tarte. Rav therefore says that the first half of our Mishnah is all talking about one thing, and Shmuel says the first half of our Mishnah is talking about two different things. Rav tani chada, Rav says it's talking about one thing, and therefore he reads the whole thing as one line. He says, sukkah miduvleles, that if you have a miduvleles sukkah, and my miduvleles midul deles, which means that there's very sparse schach, so then, as long as shetzilasa meruba mechamasa kishera. So that second line is a direct consequence of the first line. As long as you have more shade than sunlight, then it doesn't matter how sparse it is. As long as there's more shade than sunlight, it's kosher. Ushmuel tani tarti, and Shmuel says no. These two statements are taken separately. My miduvleles mevulbeles. That the first case is a sukkah midul deles, and it's telling me, which means that it's disjointed schach, and that's case number one, that's a kosher sukkah. Petarti ketani sukkah mivulbeles keshera, and so therefore there's two cases. Number one, that if you have a sukkah with disjointed schach, it's kosher, and case number two is vitzilas and ruba mechamasa keshera, if you have a sukkah which has more shade than sunlight, that's a kosher sukkah. So really, for Shmuel, it's addressing two different cases. One, the second statement is not qualifying the first statement. It goes without saying that a disjointed schach sukkah, you're going to have more shade than sunlight, but that's not what the purpose of the second phrase was. Amar Aryai.
When did they ask? We've already learned that already, that the shade is more than...
The Gemara will ask that question.
Sorry.
Very good, Mark. The Gemara is going to ask that question on Amud Beis. We'll get to there shortly. Amar Aryai. Lo shanu ela she'ein bein zeh lazeh shalosha tefachim, aval yesh bein zeh lazeh gimel tefachim pesula. Now, Aryai makes an interesting statement. He says, look, you've got disjointed schachs. I'm just going to use these cards as my illustration. You've got schach here, you've got schach here, you got a gap here, but you have schach that's elevated over here. He says, this is all fine, says Aryai, as long as vertically the distance is less than 3 tvachim, because then we apply the principle of lavud, and we therefore say that it's all connected. But if it's higher than 3 tvachim, forget it. It's not a kosher sukkah anymore. You've got a gap in the schach, because you can't conjoin those two levels. So, Amar Rava, afilu yesh bein zeh lazeh shlosha tvachim, nami lo amran, ela she'ein begago tefach, aval yesh begago tefach keshera, de amrinan chabot rameh. And Rava says, let me qualify it even further, which is as follows. If you've got your two pieces of schach on the bottom and then you've got your higher schach up here, if this higher piece of schach is 1 tefach wide, then even if it's higher than 3 tfachim, we apply a mosaic tradition, just like remember we learned about the laws of walls, right? If you have a wall that stops here, we can sometimes say, good achis mechitzta, and imagine an imaginary wall. Well, we have the same tradition like that when it comes to horizontally positioned pieces of boards or wood or whatever it is, that as long as it's 1 tefach wide, we can imagine it coming down and meeting the bottom. So therefore, if this is 1 tefach wide, you say it's a principle called guv chavot rameh. Chavot rameh is like good achis, but it's dealing with horizontal pieces instead of vertical pieces. Vertical pieces, you create an imaginary wall that's good achis. Chavot rameh is when you have a horizontal piece, you can imagine it connecting to the things that are below it. Okay?
So they have to line up, though.
They would have to line up so that when you look at it without any depth perception, they look like it's all covering up on a horizontal plane.
But it's okay horizontally. Why couldn't they use that also a few DAF ago when they were talking about the air in the middle between the two Chatzeros, and you couldn't use that horizontally?
I don't know, you'll have to show me the Gemara. I don't remember the Gemara. Amar Rava, mina aminala. So Rava says, how can I prove this to you that we apply the principle of chabot rameh? That only when the piece is 1 tefach wide, we say that we can imagine it on the same horizontal plane, but when it's less than 1 tefach, we don't say that. Ditnan. Because look at the following Mishnah from Maseches Ohalos, which is talking about the laws of Tumah and how an ohel is created. Koros habayis v'ha'aliyah shein alehem ma'azeva v'hein mechuvanos. So I want you to imagine a construction project where a house is being built. It's a two-story house, okay? And the framer has already framed the entire house. And not only has he framed the entire house with studs or 2x4s, he's also put in the walls. But he hasn't yet put in the floors. So you have no floor between the first story and the second story. You just have beams, supporting beams in place. And he also hasn't put in a roof yet for the second floor. All you have is support beams for the roof. So you've got support beams for the first story ceiling, you've got support beams for the second story ceiling, and the halacha will be as follows. You have tumah in that house, and you want to know if the other utensils in that house are tameh, do you have an ohel or not? So the case is where the support beams on the first floor are exactly parallel vertically with the support beams on the second floor. Okay? So you got that case? Like this, right? They're all structured like that. So the Mishnah in Ohalos states as follows. It says, Tuma tachas echas mehen tachteha tameh, that if you have tuma directly underneath one of the beams, if someone could open Benny's Gemara, please. If you have tuma directly underneath one of the beams, so then anything else that's directly underneath the beam, let's say you've got a piece of corpse flesh over here, and you've got a teacup over here, so then the teacup will become tameh because they're both directly under the beam. So this beam forms an ohel. Okay? So, and then it says, so, bein tachtona le'elyona beinehem tameh. If you have something that's tameh, the corpse flesh, on top of the beam of the first story, so then anything that's in between, also resting on the beam of the first story, because it has an ohel over it from the second story beam, that teacup will become tameh if it's resting on top of the first beam. Okay? So that's the first halacha. So al gavha elyona kenegda ad l'rakia tameh. And if you have tumah resting on top of the second story beam, so then everything above the second story beam that passes over that tumah will also become tameh. But nothing underneath it will become tameh because that beam acts as a partition to prevent the tumah from going downwards, just like if it's on top of the first story beam, anything beneath it will be tahor as well. Now that's case number one. Case number two, hayu ha'elyonos kebein ha'tachtonos, then the case is going to be different. Now, instead of the second story beams being exactly parallel vertically to the first story beams, they're staggered. Okay? So the first story beams are here, second story beams are here. Now, it turns out that if you're standing on the ground floor looking upwards and you have no depth perception, it looks like you have beams running across the entire length of the house without any air, without any gaps, because what you perceive is the beams from the first story being flush with the beams of the second story because you have no depth perception. Okay? So that's
standing from a distance, I guess?
You're standing on the ground. You're looking up. Mm-hmm. You're standing on the ground. You're looking up. You have no depth perception because you can only see out of one eye. It therefore looks like you've got a full ceiling because you can't tell the difference between the beams on the second story and the beams on the first story. Am I making sense now? Okay. So now the Gemara says, so in that situation, so tuma tachtehen tachas kulan tame. Tuma tachtehen, so tachas kulan tame. So if there is tuma on the ground floor, so then anywhere that the tuma is, then anywhere where a keli is will become tameh because you've got basically an ohel now completely covering. It's like a full ceiling covering the tuma. Al gabeyan kenegdan ad l'rakia tameh. And if you've got something on top of the beams, then only that which goes directly over the beam up until the ad infinitum upwards will become tameh. So that's the general rule, okay? V'tani Allah, and it was taught about that by Medvar Mamurim, Bisman sheyesh bohen tefach u'b'neim poseach tefach. That this will only work that we say chabot rami, and we imagine the beams as being flush adjacent to each other on a same horizontal plane, is only if these beams are one tefach wide. Then we can imagine them coming down and meeting each other. Okay, on the same horizontal plane. However, aval ein b'neim poseach tefach tuma tachas echas mehen tachteha tameh b'neim al gabeim tor. However, if that's not the case, if let's say the beams are less than one tefach in width, then we're not going to have that same principle of saying chabot rami and imagining all of the beams as contiguous with each other, and therefore we would just say then tuma tachas echas mehen tachteha tameh. Then only the things that are directly resting underneath any particular beam are going to be tameh and be matame the things that are underneath it. But beineim v'al gabeim tor, but things that are in between the boards. If let's say you're on the first floor and you're in between the second story, the first story beams, because the second story beams are less than a tefach, we don't say chabod rami. We don't say that you imagine this coming down. So therefore, it doesn't form a sufficient ohel to tell you that the entire house is going to be tameh. So the bottom line is, so you see from here, Alma, ki is beitefach amrinan chabot rami, v'chi les beitefach lo amrinan chabot rami shmamina. So you see that this principle of chabot rami, that we imagine that the two horizontal planes are actually imagined as adjacent to each other, we don't say that unless the beams or the slats or the boards are a tefach wide. Fine. Yasiv Rav Kahana Kamer La Hashmaita Amar Le Ravashi Le Rav Kahana B'chol Heicha Deles Beitefach Lormin Chabot Rami. Oh, so Rav Kahana, you really are saying that if the slats or the beams are less than one tefach, then you don't say the principle of Chabot Rami. You don't imagine them on the same horizontal plane. V'hatanya, I'll prove to you that we do, because we have a brisa, and now we're going back to Hilchas Shabbos, Hilchas Erevin, right? We've seen this brisa before. Korah hayotza mikosel zeh ve'eno nagas bekosel zeh. We had seen that you need to put a korah, which is a horizontal bar, over the entrance of the mavoi to enable you to carry in the mavoi. But let's say it comes out of one side of the entrance, but it's not long enough to meet the other side of the entrance. Or if you have two horizontal beams coming out from either side of the entrance, but there's a small gap in between the two beams, so if you have a gap of less than 3 tvachim in either case, where the beam doesn't exactly go all the way to the end and meet where it's supposed to, so then that's okay. We apply the principle of lavud. But if there's more than a 3 tefach gap, then we don't apply the principle of lavud, and you have to bring another piece of material, another piece of wood, or another piece of stick in order to supplement it. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, and he says, no, pachos me'arboin tzarach lahavi kora acheres, arba tzarach lahavi kora acheres. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel just argues about the law of lavud. All along we've been saying that lavud is 3 tvach, less than 3 tvachim. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel has a tradition that lavud is less than 4 tvachim. Now we're going to see Rabbi Shimon Gamliel throughout Shas. His shita is a das yachid. We don't paskin like that. We don't hold like that. The Gemara doesn't usually reckon with it. But in a brisa or in a mishnah, sometimes you'll see Rabbi Shimon Gamliel's position being quoted that lavud is 4 tvachim instead of 3. So we're just bringing this in. Now, v'chein.
What are we comparing here? I don't understand.
You'll
That's
see.
a horizontal plane, right?
Please allow me to finish the brisa, then you'll see. Okay. V'chein shtei koros hamasimos. Lo bezu kedei lakabel ariach v'lo bezu kedei lakabel ariach. Next case of the brisa. The brisa is working under the assumption that in order for the korah at the entrance of the mavi to be kosher, it needs to be a tefach wide. If you have 2 sticks that are adjacent to each other and neither one is a tefach, each stick is narrower than a tefach width, but you put them adjacent to each other, so then, as long as imekablos ariach l'rachbo tefach ein tzarach lahavi kora acheres v'imlav tzarach lahavi kora acheres, as long as the 2 put together are 1 tefach in width, such that a brick could be rested upon it. Usually, the brick that's called an ariach is 1.5 tefachim. So that we say that you could cement it in such a way that the edges of the 1.5 tefach brick would be protruding off the sides of this 1 tefach wide slat. That's okay. It's still going to be kosher. V'imlav tzarach lahavi kora acheres. But if it's still not going to make up a 1 tefach width by putting the 2 sticks together, you're going to have to get something else to supplement the width measurement. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel Omer in mekablos ariach la'arko shlosha tvachim ein tzarach lahavi kora acheres v'imlav tzarach lahavi kora acheres. Rashi explains that Rabbi Shimon Gamliel is coming to be makel, and he's coming to say that even if both sticks are quite narrow, right, like this, but you can distance them apart from each other such that if you put a brick over them, using the airspace between them, they could support the weight of a 3 tefach brick, right, along the side of them like this, then that's a kosher korah. It doesn't have to be a contiguous solid. It could be 2 little, very narrow sticks, but as long as they're sturdy enough to support a 3 tefach brick like this, then that's a kosher korah. So far, we have not gotten to where we need to get. So, Rabbi, suddenly now we're going to get to it, okay? So hayu echas lamayla ve'echas lamata. What if you have 2 sticks? Right? Each one of them is a half a tefach, and you want to put them adjacent to each other. The only problem is that one stick is over here and the other stick is over here. And they're running across the entrance of your mavoi, right? And you want to know whether this is a kosher korah or not, because together they make up 1 tefach width. Is this kosher or not? So therefore, the Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda says, Rowan ha'elyona ki'ilu hilamata, Vesatachtona ki'ilu hilamayla, uvilvad shelo tehei elyona lamayla me'esrim ama vatachtona lamata me'asara. So then it's okay, provided that the upper one is not higher than 20 amos, and the lower one is not lower than 10 tfachim, because we know that in order for the korah to be kosher, it needs the same vertical criteria as schach and a sukkah. It can't be higher than 20 amos, and it can't be lower than 10 tfachim. But but you see that even if one would be at, let's say, 19 amos high, and the other one would just be 4 amos high, we could say chabot rami and imagine that these 2 sticks are on the same flush horizontal plane. So you see, you say chabot rami even though these 2 sticks are less than a tefach wide. So Rava, I challenge you. You say you only apply the principle of chabot rami when the surfaces are a tefach wide. Here you see that even when they're each a half a tefach, you could still conjoin them to say that it's a full tefach width, even though there's less than a tefach in each one. Okay, so the Gemara says, Amar lei, so Rava says, Teritz ve'ema hachi. Uvilvad shelo tehe elyona lamayla me'esrim ela besoch esrim v'hatachtona smucha la bepachos mishlosha inami bilvad shelo tehe tachton lamata me'asara ela lamayla me'asara ve'elyona smucha la bepachos mishlosha aval shlosha keven deles beitefach lo omrinan chabot rami. So Rav says that's not the correct understanding of the brisa. What the brisa over there in Shabbos means is that the two half tefach sticks that are comprising the korah have to be vertically within 3 tvachim of each other to apply the principle of lavud. We don't say chabot rami when we're dealing with sticks that are narrower than a tefach, right? All the brisa means to say is that it's okay as long as the top one is not higher than 20. It's got to be just a little bit lower than 20, and the one below it has to be within 3 tvachim of that. Alternatively, if the lower one is very low, you have to make sure it's a little bit higher than 10 tvachim, and the one higher than it has to be within 3 tvachim height of that. So that's what the brisa means. The brisa is not suggesting that one could be just under 20 amos and the other one could be just higher than 10 tvachim. Oh no, you don't say chabod rami. It's saying that if it's really high, then it could be like this, and if it's really low, it could be like that. That's the response of Rava. And we don't say chabot rami when the surfaces are narrower than a tefach. Let's go on to the next statement, which, remember, according to Shmuel, was an independent statement. As long as as long as there is more shade than sunlight, it is kosher. So we're going to get to Mark's issue in just a second. Haki hadari pesula. It sounds like from our Mishnah that if it's 50-50, 50% shade and 50% sunlight, then it's going to be puzzle. You need to have more shade than sunlight. V'hatznan be'idach pirkin, but we learned in the previous parak that v'shechamasa meruba mitzilasa pesula haki hadadi kishera. It said in the previous Mishnah, in the previous parak, that if there's more sunlight than shade, then it's puzzle, which implies that if it's 50-50, it's kosher. So which is it? Is 50-50 kosher or is 50-50 puzzle, as is implied by our Mishnah? The Gemara says, lo kasha, kan milamala, kan milamata. Answers the Gemara that it's really no contradiction. In reality, you need to have more than 50% shade, right? But what the Mishnayos are saying are as follows. When you look at the size of the aperture versus the side of the covered part, if you go right up against the SUKKAH, if it's just 50-50, it's going to be puzzle. That's what the implication of our Mishnah is. In the previous parak, when it was suggesting that 50-50 is kosher, it's when you look at the ground of the sukkah and you measure how much shade there is versus sunlight looking at the ground. The reason is, why is there a difference? Because light diffuses. When it hits a surface, how many of you remember making a pinhole camera? Am I the only nerd or geek in this crowd? Mark, have you made a pinhole camera? So what is a pinhole camera? Pinhole camera is where you create this structure, you just put a little pin on a shoebox, and the light comes completely through, and it can diffuse on the back of the box an upside down image. Light diffuses even through a very small aperture, right? And so when you have 50% opening in the ceiling, you're going to have much more sunlight on the ground. Obviously, so what the Gemara is suggesting is, when you measure sunlight from the ground, if you have 50% of sunlight versus 50% of shade, then it's a kosher sukkah, because then that guarantees that the top part is going to have much more shade than sunlight.
Shade from the walls, though, if you're looking at the ground. Is there no shade from the walls?
So you have to say that you're looking at a reflection of the SUKKAH when it's noon, whenever it is. You don't take into account the shade from the walls. I'm saying that's what the Gemara is suggesting.
How do we possibly now when we want to make that decision? Do we go with the SUKKAH or the ground? The floor?
Well, it seems that you need to have more than 50%. I believe that's the psak. You need to look at the ceiling and say that it's not. There's no machlokas here. The Gemara is saying everyone agrees. It's when you're looking at the ceiling, you need to have more than 50%. When you're looking at the ground, 50% is sufficient. You see? Okay. So the Gemara says, Amar of Papa, Hainu Darmi Inshi, Kizuza Milael, Kiistera Milatachas. He says that explains, is a common saying, that if you look up at an aperture where it's at, it could be the size of a zuz, but if you look at the ground and you want to see the sunlight reflected by that aperture, it'll be the size of a sela, which is a much larger coin. So that's the same idea. Let's go on. Ma'uva kimin bias. If the schach is really, really thick, so that you can't see the stars, we said that that's still kosher, even though the objective is to be able to see the stars. Tana Rabbanan ha'ma'uva kimin bias afal pishan ha'kochavim nirin mitocha k'sheira. So, like the Brisa says, the same statement, that if it's very thick and you can't see the stars, it's still kosher. But ein kochvei chama nirin mitocha beishamai poslim beislom akshirin. What if it's so thick that even during the daytime, the sparks of light from the sun are not visible in the sukkah? I mean, this is mamish. It's like when you go to a hotel, they have those curtains that make everything feel like it's nighttime, the blackout curtains. If your schach is so dark that you can't even see any beams, any streaks of sunlight come in during the daytime, so then you have a machlokas beishamai beisil. Beishamai say that's possible, beisil say it's still kosher. Let's go on to the next Mishnah. Ha'osa sukaso barosh ha'agala o barosh ha'sfina k'sheira va'olun la biyom tov. That if a person makes a sukkah on the top of a wagon or on the top of or on a boat, it's kosher. It's a kosher sukkah, and you're even allowed to enter into this sukkah on Yantiv. Let's say, assuming let's say you're in a wagon, a really big wagon, and it's traveling on Yantiv. You're already in there. You're on a high-speed train or whatever it is, and you got a sukkah on there. It's kosher. You can even go in there in Yantiv. If you're on a boat and it's docked, or if you're on a boat and you're already out in the middle of the ocean, you can go into that sukkah on Yantiv. It's no problem.
I thought you said yesterday that we were talking about the Chabad mobile, So
right. So we're talking only in Rabbi Yehuda, if you remember.
That was his.
So the simple understanding is that this does not go according to Rabbi Yehuda. Although Mark showed me yesterday that there's a Ran who says that Rabbi Yehuda would hold that this is still kosher. Tzarchiyun. But the point is that the Mishnah is saying, at least according to the Chachamim, we know that this is still kosher. Now, Barosh Ha'ilan o al gabe gamal keshera ve'ein olun la biyom tov. If, however, the sukkah is on the top of a tree, it's a tree house sukkah, it's a tree sukkah, right? Or if it's on top of a camel, let's say your Chabad mobile in the olden days. Do you think Chabadniks made the sukkahs on camels in the old days?
Avram Avinu was Chabad.
Avram Avinu was a Chabadnik, so he must have had a sukkah. He must have had a sukkah on a camel, right? So if there were camels in Avram Avinu's time, there was just an article that there were no camels back then. Anyway, I don't know. So ve'ein olin la biyom tov. But so it's a kosher sukkah, but you're not allowed to go into it on Yantav. Why? Because you're not allowed to ascend a tree or ascend or mount an animal on Yantav. Well, and we know that that's a gezerah, that the Chachamim didn't want you to go to use any Baal Chai or any Tzomeach. You can't climb it or even utilize its surfaces on Shabbos or Yantav, lest you break a branch and so forth. That was a gezerah's Chachamim. And now, let's talk about now. So, but it's still a kosher sukkah. So on Chol HaMoed, you can go into that sukkah. Okay. Shtayim be'ilan ve'echas b'dei adam, o shtayim b'dei adam ve'echas be'ilan keshera, ve'ein olin la biyom tov. Let's say you have only some of the walls. A kosher sukkah is 3 walls. So let's say you have 2 of the walls are in the tree, and 1 wall is supported by the ground. It goes all the way down to the ground. Or even if 1 wall is supported by the tree and 2 walls go all the way to the ground, it is a kosher sukkah. But again, because the sukkah is partially supported by the tree, you cannot go into that sukkah on Yantiv. Shalosh b'dei adam ve'echas be'ilan keshera ve'olin la b'yom tov. If, however, 3 of the walls go all the way down to the ground and the 4th wall is supported by a tree, since you have a kosher sukkah without that 4th wall that's supported by the tree, you're not only is it kosher, but you're allowed to go into it in Yantiv. Zeh klal, and the general rule therefore is kol sheyinatel ha'ilan v'yachol lama b'fnei atzma keshera v'olin la b'yom tov. The rule is that if the tree were to disappear and you would still have a kosher sukkah, then the sukkah is kosher and you're allowed to go into it on Yantiv. But if the walls are so dependent upon the tree that in order for it to be a kosher sukkah, and you need the tree to prop it up. And if the tree disappears, the sukkah collapses, so then you can't go into it on Yom Tov. You have a wonderful day. We'll continue to.